And this polling question will lead us into our next topic that we'll have immediately following the break. So the question is, have you experienced a change in stop loss coverage directly attributable to cell and gene therapies? And different responses here around who initiated it or whether you had any at all. So if you folks would take a minute to respond to that, we'd really appreciate it. Okay, great. So let's show you the responses. It looks like the majority of folks, 63%, have had no changes that they would attribute to cell and gene therapies directly. Those that have had changes, the vast majority, so 30% of those that had the changes initiated by the stop loss vendor. So that's a great backdrop as we go into the break. Before the break, your poll indicated that you haven't seen too much happen with your stop loss coverage relative to cell and gene therapies, short of a few that have had some actions on the part of their stop loss insurer. So we're going to have a session today that I've really been looking forward to with Mabe Koja, who's joining us from BCS Financial Corporation, where he's Chief Actuary. He's also President of Medical Risk Managers. And Mabe's going to take us through some of the implications of cell and gene therapies for employer stop-loss coverage. So over to you, Mabe.
All right, thanks, Jane. You can hear me okay? All right, so good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining the discussion today. I'm going to focus on the impact of cell and gene therapy on stop-loss coverage. As Jane said, my name is Mabe Koja, and I'm the Chief Actuary at BCS Financial, as well as the President of Medical Risk Managers. Both of these companies are focused in the stop-loss marketplace, and I've worked as an actuary in this space for roughly the past 20 years. I thought it would be useful to just frame the purpose of stop-loss coverage for those who are new to the product. Essentially, self-insured plans typically do not take 100% exposure when they are self-insured. They purchase insurance or reinsurance meant to offset some of the highest cost claims. And we call this the actuarial risk. It's in two forms. There's severity risk and frequency risk. Severity is in the form of an extremely high cost claimant, and frequency meaning having multiple of those high cost claimants. So both of these types of risk create volatility for the self-insured plan. And since these plans, they need to budget for their expenses at the beginning of the year. And it's common for those plan sponsors to purchase stop-loss coverage because it essentially helps them protect the budget. It moves a component of risk from unexpected to expected. And typically the stop loss makes up something like 3% to 15% of the total expenses. So smaller employers, it'll cost more like 15% of the total because they're offloading more risk. Larger employers take less risk. And so maybe their expense as a total is more like 3%. So as I mentioned, smaller employers are typically buying both individual or per person coverage, and they also buy aggregate coverage. The individual product protects from severity risk, and the aggregate product protects from frequency risk. But as employers grow in size, they tend to buy less and less of this type of stop loss coverage. They typically do not buy aggregate coverage as you become a larger employer. And that's simply due to the law of large numbers. The risk becomes more and more predictable. And so from that standpoint, you need less and less of the aggregate type of coverage. I thought it would also be helpful to frame who the stop loss insurers are in the market and where employers typically buy this type of coverage from. The large national carriers, health insurers like Anthem, Aetna, Cigna, and United Healthcare, they all participate in this market and provide stop loss coverage to the clients that they provide administration to. Similarly, other regional health plans like the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, and if you live around the MIT area, you're probably familiar with Harvard Pilgrim and Tufts. These are two other regional health plans that recently merged. They similarly provide this stop loss coverage. And then we have this segment of third-party carriers. Some of them are specialty life insurers, and some of them are property casualty carriers. And I've named a few who are in that space. Just a little bit about the marketplace. It's about a $25 billion marketplace. It has doubled since the full implementation of the Affordable Care Act in 2014. The biggest driver there were two things. It was the growth of the self-insured marketplace, and then also coverage for, basically the removal of lifetime maximums and annual maximums, and the coverage basically extended to unlimited. So let's get into cell and gene therapy and how that can impact stop loss coverage. The diagonal line in this graph measures where an employer is buying coverage. And so as mentioned before, smaller employers buy lower deductibles of coverage. So for example, a 500 life employer is likely purchasing a $50,000 deductible, meaning they want more protection from high claim volatility. But as you grow in employer size, a 5,000 life group, for example, or maybe a 10,000 life group, for example, these larger employers are buying higher deductibles, maybe 500,000 or $1 million deductible, that type of policy, meaning they're taking on more self-insured risk. So we know that gene therapies and cell therapies are typically costing $1 million plus. And so as long as you're purchasing stop loss coverage, these claims by and large are going to be covered. I'll slightly caveat that, and we'll come back to some issues we see with gene therapy a little later on. But by and large, if you're buying stop loss coverage, you're going to be covered from cell and gene therapy claims. And you'll protect yourself from that type of claim volatility, as you would for any claim that was exceeding the deductible that you purchased. Now, that said, we start to see employers who have 10,000 lives and above start to go without stop loss coverage. So a 10,000 life employer, for example, spends roughly $120 million a year in healthcare expenses for medical and pharmacy. And traditionally, an unexpected $1 or $2 million claim just didn't create that much volatility for that size of an employer. But as Jane and Mark mentioned before, the pipeline for these therapies is pretty deep, and we think that there's going to be a lot more volatility, and we think that larger employers are going to rethink the need for this type of coverage. So again, by and large, for the plan sponsors that are buying stop loss coverage, they will be protected from cell and gene therapy claims the same way they would for other high cost medications, for hospitalizations, and what have you. There are some caveats to that, and we'll dive into some issues that we see with stop loss coverage and gene therapy. So the first issue I wanted to speak of is the difference between known and unknown claims. Stop loss coverage, like most insurance coverages, are meant to protect from unknown claims. And so let's think about spinal muscular atrophy and the coverage and the treatment of Zolgensma. We know that SMA can be identified pretty early on in the process now. And by the time the child is born, you know pretty quickly if that child is going to need Zolgensma. And so you can consider that to be an unknown claim. That's not something that we see coming. And because of that, that's the type of claim that would be covered by stop loss. Now, the flip side to that is, let's say an infant is using Spinraza at the moment, and we know that because we can see the usage of that drug in the claims data. And knowing that the infant may be a candidate for Zolgensma, um, they may actually be excluded from stop loss coverage because the fact that they're using Spinraza today identifies them as a known claimant. And so there's a term in stop loss called lasering. And this is where the stop loss carriers will either exclude members from coverage or include them, but at a much higher deductible. Hemophilia is a topic that gets spoke of a lot in stop loss, and that's because the factor medication is extremely expensive and it's an ongoing medication, which means the stop loss carrier can see that claimant in the claim data. And because of that, that's typically considered a known claimant. Now, it does happen where employees are using that treatment, and they may perhaps change employers, and it may not have been identified at the time of underwriting, but by the time the coverage is in place, a member has joined newly to the plan and is using that factor medication. And then in that situation, that patient would be considered an unknown claimant. So this topic of known and unknown claimants and lasering and stop loss, it typically is not well received, and because purchasers of stop loss coverage feel like you're avoiding the risk. But the reality is there's other insurance coverages that treat known claimants differently. So if you look at the bottom here, in life insurance, it's very common to see difference in rates for smokers versus non-smokers. If you're thinking about auto insurance, certainly there's safe driver discounts versus those that are not as safe drivers. When we think about cyber insurance, this is an area of a lot of discussion lately, but there are companies that have been known for multiple breaches. And so for them to secure cyber insurance would be harder versus a company who hasn't had that history of breaches. And malpractice is another one, errors and omissions. You can name several types of insurance coverages that differ rates for higher utilizers versus lower utilizers, or known versus unknown risk. So when it comes to medical and pharmacy, when we as a carrier see an individual that is on an ongoing type of drug that is extremely expensive, like factor medication, that is typically considered a known claimant. Similarly, another high cost procedure is an organ transplant, and we tend to know that in advance because before you can get the transplant, you need to be on a donor wait list, and that's usually known information. Unknown claims are unexpected hospitalizations, and then again, like cell and gene therapy, new treatments that come to market, these would be covered as unknown claims. I put this topic of annuitized payments for gene therapy. So this is an interesting one. And Mark mentioned some of the payment models that are available. And so, just, for the sake of easy math, let's say there's a $5 million treatment that could be spread. The cost could be spread 1 million per year over the course of 5 years. And while that might provide some cash flow stability to an employer, from a stop loss perspective, you actually would rather have that full cost paid immediately as opposed to having multiple payments, because if that claim is paid immediately, it would apply towards the stop loss policy, which tends to be 1-year policies. We'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute. Another issue that I see here is just general misalignment between employers, stop loss insurers, and reinsurers. It is very common for stop loss insurers to purchase reinsurance. And it is common for reinsurers and stop loss insurers to have their own exclusion lists or their terms and conditions. And then typically an employer has a plan document that governs the way they will reimburse claims. And it's important that when it comes to gene therapy, that all three of these entities are in the same philosophy on how they want cell and gene therapies covered. Here's a perfect example. Zolgensma, for example, the FDA says that that treatment is available for children up to the age of 2, but a a health plan could limit that to something lower. That's their prerogative to limit it to something lower. And let's say, for example, they limited it to 1.5 years old. And so in that situation, it could be that the employer intended to cover the treatment up to the age of 2, but the stop loss carrier only covers the treatment until age 1.5. And in that situation, you essentially have a gap in coverage for the employer. So it's very common for an employer to ask that their plan is mirrored in the stop loss agreement. I also think it'll be important for employers to just understand who are the reinsurers that are protecting the stop loss carrier that they're doing business with. This is not a place that typically the employers are asking questions about. Typically, employers are using brokers and consultants to help with this placement. We think that's a place that brokers and consultants will get smarter on and bring more value to their employer clients. The next one here is an item that I already mentioned. Larger employers don't typically buy stop loss insurance. And so we think that this space will probably change. Again, those employers that are 10,000 lives and above, they typically were not seeing a lot of volatility from $1 and $2 million claims. Now, as we get into the world of $3 to $5 million claims and the frequency of those claims increases, that's a newfound volatility for employers that are in that 10,000 life to maybe 35,000 life segment. Once you get beyond that place, I think, again, the law of large numbers kind of mitigates the volatility. But certainly for this segment, 10,000 lives to 35,000 lives, we think that that this is a place where these employers who traditionally were not purchasing stop loss coverage, they will think about buying this type of coverage. These are large employers. A lot of times they are publicly traded, which means they have balance sheet implications. And my guess is these large plan CFOs will want some type of sleep at night protection. And the final issue I wanted to mention here is durability and subrogation. So I can't remember which treatment it was, but Mark had mentioned a treatment that was not working just yet. And there's going to be other treatments that over the course of time just do not work after some time. And so what we'll see happen is that the stop loss insurers who cover these treatments, who reimburse the employers who have claims, they will want to track that patient into the future, essentially to confirm that the treatment is still durable. And the reason for that is because of the warranty models, there may be a return of some or all dollars at some point in the future if the treatment is no longer durable. So in insurance, the term that we use is subrogation. This is where when an insurer reimburses a claim and finds out later that it's no longer a claim, they have the right to be reimbursed first. And as Jane and Mark had mentioned, there's just a lot of mobility that could happen with self-insured employers. They could change payers, they could change employers, they could change stop loss carriers. This will be a place where the stop loss marketplace will need some help. And we expect that either the stop loss insurers will develop capabilities to track these members into the future to ensure that the treatments are still working. And if they don't develop those capabilities, then they would look to partner with vendors who have those types of capabilities. So just kind of summarizing the topics here, as Mark had mentioned, stop loss insurance will cover cell and gene therapy in most cases and for most employers. There will be the one that I see having probably the most issues right now is hemophilia, because as it is, factor medication is extremely expensive, and it has been common in the stop loss marketplace for several years for the stop loss insurers to avoid those members by using the term lasering. And as that gene therapy comes to market, it was mentioned before that the price tag on that coverage is going to be in the $4 to $5 million range. And because of that, the marketplace will view that individual who has hemophilia as a known claimant. And because of that, it'll likely be excluded from coverage. Other treatments that we see in the market right now, a lot of them are intended for children, infant children, and a lot of those claims, you won't be able to see them coming, which is what keeps it as an unknown claimant. And so for that reason, for by and large, stop loss insurance will protect from most cell and gene therapy treatments. And then I did mention that large and jumbo employers that are not really buying this type of coverage today, we think that that's going to change. We think that there's a need for coverage for these larger employers. Again, typically not very volatile. High cost claims haven't been very volatile for large employers, but we think that that's going to change with the pipeline that we see in cell and gene therapy. I had mentioned this topic of annuitized payments versus a one-time expense. So if you're a plan sponsor who's not buying stop loss coverage, then having annuitized payments brings you some cash flow protection and kind of smooths out these payments over time. And that's easier to stomach than a one-time hit. But that said, if you are buying stop loss coverage, having that one-time hit is actually more favorable because that one-time hit would then be covered by the stop loss policy. Taking that a step further for employers who are buying stop loss coverage and have a gene therapy and have annuitized payments and then change carriers in subsequent years, that will become hard for the next stop loss carrier to cover that annuitized payment because they will view that as a known claimant. And then finally, this idea of alignment between employers, stop loss insurers, and reinsurers. We think that this is extremely important. There's, before gene therapy, there have been situations. There is a lawsuit working its way through the state of Connecticut right now, where an employer is suing for recoverables from a stop loss carrier that had an extremely high cost claim, and the stop loss carrier had reinsurance, but the reinsurer and the stop loss carrier had a different view of the claims. And so because of that, there's an issue there between the insurer and the reinsurer, and the employer is left holding the bag waiting to be reimbursed for this claim. And so we see that same issue likely occurring with cell and gene therapies unless the employer, the stop loss carrier, and the reinsurer are all aligned on how the employer wishes to cover this and how the stop loss carrier wishes to cover it. We have seen that reinsurers some of them are stepping away from cell and gene therapy coverage because this is low frequency and high severity, and it becomes really hard for them to price for this utilization. And so we've seen reinsurers tend to step away from providing coverage in this space. So it's really important to check with your stop loss carrier if they're purchasing reinsurance and if they foresee any issues with their reinsurers covering cell and gene therapy. And that's the end of my presentation. Jane, I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has.
Oh, great. Thank you, Mabe. So you, I think, did a great job of taking a very complex area and making it understandable. So remind folks that you can submit questions through the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. And we do have a question from Victoria who's asking, how will reinsurers know if a warranty is available for a specific gene or cell therapy?
Yeah, they probably will not know. And I'm not as smart on this topic of warranties as I should be. But if I think about it from a different perspective, a lot of drug manufacturers negotiate deals with pharmacy benefit managers. And those deals vary employer to employer and health plan to health plan. And so just because you know of a drug and just because you have that drug through a PBM, that doesn't mean that the warranty model or the rebates, for example, will be the same employer to employer. So from that perspective, it would be really hard for a reinsurer to know if there is a warranty model. These would likely be questions that the reinsurers will start asking about as they become more knowledgeable about the treatments.
Great. And Lucas asks, how could annuitized payment for new claimants work in the context of single-year stop-loss policies?
So again, an annuitized payment brings cash flow stability to the plan sponsor. But if that plan sponsor is buying stop loss coverage, they don't really need the cash flow favorability. They'd actually rather take the full hit of the claimant all up front because it would be covered by the stop loss policy.
Okay. Michael asks, would that also make a multi-year payment cause a laser in subsequent years?
It likely would. It likely would. There are also provisions by which a claim is covered, and they're governed by a contract basis, and that's when the claim is incurred and when the claim is paid. And so a long-term payment model probably has the claim incurral occurring a year prior or 2 years prior or even 3 years prior. And stop loss policies are very specific as to when they will cover those claims. And so because of that, those claims, because they may have been incurred years prior to, will likely not be covered.
Great. And I have myself a kind of a burning question here. So as employers have experience in covering these cases, as we get more high cost cases and the frequency, just the number of drugs that are approved in this space increases, what are the implications for stop loss premiums over time?
So that's a really good question. I think the impact on premium will be mitigated for plans that are buying lower deductibles. Um, let's go to the most extreme example and go to a fully insured employer who is passing off all the risk to an insurance carrier. We think that impact is going to be pretty small because that's a large pool of risk to spread risk across. As you go up in deductible, that's where you're going to start seeing cell and gene therapy really start having a sizable impact on stop loss premiums. And the largest place where it will have an impact is at reinsurance. So reinsurance is typically really small dollars, and they're meant to cover claims that exceed $2 million. If you have a new set of treatments and frequency at that level, then it's not crazy to think that reinsurance rates could go up, double from where they are. But keep in mind that doubling is occurring on a really small dollar amount. And so it's more and more impactful as you go up in deductible.
All right. And that reinsurance cost will get eventually passed down to the stop loss premium.
Yes, but
Okay.
where again, if we're talking about the average deductible in this marketplace is about $150,000. And so
Mm-hmm.
if a $2 million reinsurance rate doubles, the impact of that on a $150,000 policy shouldn't be shouldn't be like too bad. But that said, as more of these claims, more of the pipeline develops and the frequency increases, we should expect this marketplace to increase its premiums to absorb the risk.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Mabe. Great presentation. And we'll see Mabe again in our panel at the end of the day. So if you have other questions, you can add them now and we'll catch up with them later, or as we get into the panel, we'll address those.